I'm John Atack.
And I'm Michelle Haslam.
And this is the first time that we've sat and had a conversation like this, so it's really exciting. Michelle was involved in the new Kadampa tradition. First bit that confuses me is, how can you have a new tradition?
It's all a contradiction, isn't it? Yeah.
And what is a Kadampa?
Well, a new Kadampa is different to an old Kadampa, seems.
Yeah.
But yeah, the whole thing is, in terms of describing it as modern Buddhism, none of it really makes sense once you've been around a while and you've also looked at other streams of Buddhism. But when you're on the inside, you maybe just believe that's what it is.
So, yeah. I mean, we were just, before we started this, we were talking about mindfulness, and I am, our friend Christian Sherko and I have frequently spoken out against this. My background was in Zen Buddhism. I learned Zazen in a monastery, which was not in the least bit exotic, sadly. Didn't have to go to Japan or see any cherry blossoms or anything.
No.
And I practiced for a year, and I practiced meditations of various forms, and I've come to believe that mindfulness is hokum, that it's being offered as a panacea, as a cure-all, which it most certainly isn't. And it's really an excuse for not helping people often. And I was saying that I found that really just breathing deeply in a relaxed position, listening to some calming music, I think should be run as a test against meditation. I'd be happy to set a program up because I think it's probably more effective. How much, what sort of meditation do they do in NKT?
Well, I wouldn't call it meditation. I would call it guided self-hypnosis and thought control and emotional control. So, and there's some visualization and prayers as well. So, it would be called contemplation meditation. Yep. So you take an aspect of the teaching and you hold it in mind. And you're supposed to be able to reduce this intellectual concept into some kind of feeling and focus on that feeling.
Yeah.
So actually what you're doing is controlling your mind and your emotions in accordance with the teachings. But this is called contemplation meditation.
And could you give me an example of something you might contemplate in such a...
Yes, so it might be one aspect of the teachings would be how human beings have no faults. So there might be quite a long teaching introducing you to this concept where they would talk about how basically all the things that people do is due to their delusions, and therefore they're sort of perfect and they're an expression of Buddha, and how someone who's actually being abusive is your teacher, etc., not an abuser. So
Jack the Ripper or Ted Bundy were really teaching lots of people.
Yes, yeah. So then you would focus on that for the rest of the meditation. And no, I don't think it's really very clear exactly what you're supposed to be doing, but everyone else is kind of appearing to be doing that.
To do it too.
And so what we're learning now with the research that's coming out, you probably wouldn't have read it yet. Miriam Anders is publishing research now on how the Buddhist concepts have been oversimplified and decontextualized and then used with a hidden agenda. So, for example, in the NKT, in my opinion, it may also happen in other Buddhist groups. I've been told it does. That teaching is actually used to dismiss people's trauma and suffering when they're abused by others, because they're all concentrating on how other people are perfect and therefore they can do no wrong, but particularly other people in your group, not they are somehow more perfect than people on the outside. So what happens is you've been focusing on this concept for so long, so repeatedly. What happened to me personally is I was too busy focusing on this concept during moments of abuse to actually protect myself, and to put boundaries in and say, actually, this behaviour is abuse. So that's just one example. There are lots of them, and I would argue that most of them, that the hidden agenda behind it is to keep you within the group, and to keep you from speaking up about things that people do that are unacceptable, to stop you whistleblowing, and to basically, and also to to sort of silence trauma into non-existence, really. So the only other form of meditation that they do is a brief mindfulness of the breath at the beginning, which they say is designed to settle the mind, to basically make it more susceptible to the teachings. So, and then there's the sort of anesthetic relaxation benefit that people get, which, because most people are stressed when they come, they do feel more relaxed. I would say that really it's just mind control and thought control, but you're told it's meditation, and it's pure and it's wonderful and it's nectar and it's blissful, and so maybe you just believe that it is.
And your background is unusual in that you have a doctorate in psychology. So you don't really have any excuses, actually.
Yeah, I know.
And I think it's an astonishing criticism of the teaching of psychology, that I came the other way around. I had a 9-year cult experience and then wanted to know what had happened. And so spent years and years looking at ideas within psychology and realizing that in clinical psychology, you're often pretty much being taught a kind of cultic dogma that, and I'm a big fan of, say, Aaron Beck and his work on cognitive ideas. I think that in certain contexts, cognitive behavioral therapy can be very useful. But there seems to be this focus on the self and the past, rather than often with dynamic therapies that you're looking to what happened to you in the past, without an understanding of how groups function and how authority relationships function within groups. So one of my friends, a principal part of her work is repurposing counsellors who have become devastated by their supervisors. That they found themselves in situations where they're being gaslit by their own supervisors. And that we find, I think, a much more significant amount of narcissism among counsellors than in any other profession. People who are perpetuating they did something that they felt was the thing that gave them the way, the truth and the life, and now they're going to impose it on other people as the solution.
There's a lot of evangelical ideas in psychology,
I mean, in talking, I always say nasty things about Freud, and anybody who thinks otherwise should maybe read Anthony Storr's Vita Clay, is a great book, but Frederick Crews, who spent 700 pages dismissing and denying every single principal idea of Freudianism in terms of its origins, in that he shows that Freud stole ideas from everywhere and anywhere. And those ideas don't actually fit together into anything that's been scientifically proven. Yet if you challenge them, the Freudian community will rip you to pieces. They won't have a conversation with you about it. I mean, there are exceptions. There are analysts, friend Dan Shaw, for example. He's brilliant. But he comes out of the Ferenczi. Ferenczi was the last of the Freud pupils who said, "What about love, Sigmund?" and was thrown out because that's not a concept that's relevant at all. It's, it's all about between the age of 1 and 1.5, you develop fixations upon your mum or your dad, and there was some penis envy involved and a little bit of castration going on, and Electra and Oedipus, and all of these crazy ideas to me, which when I first encountered them coming out of Scientology, because Scientology claimed that its origins were in Freud, in the subject Hubbard called Dianetics, I went and read Freud, and it was just like reading Hubbard.
Really?
There was this paranoid guy who felt everybody was out to get him and who was like absolutely brilliant and really didn't have that much to say. I wonder, does NKT have a kind of, religious doctrines usually split into the magical, the mystical or intellectual, and the devotional. And Christianity, because it's largely devotional, Christians aren't necessarily aware of the magical aspects, which is trying to get power for the self, or the mystical elements, which is trying to understand the world. Buddhism is fundamentally a mystical teaching, but almost everywhere it's practiced, it's like Amida Buddhism, for example, it's devotional. Does NKT fixate on the leader?
Oh, it's very devotional to the leader, much more than Buddha.
Yeah. He's a living Buddha, or?
Yeah, they do consider him the third, living Buddha. So, of course, an enlightened being who is omnipotent and omniscient and all those things. Lots of ex-members would consider it a personality cult, really. I was told things like, Geshe says it, so it must be true, There isn't much critical thinking allowed. So if you don't take on the teachings, it's because you don't have the right karma, or you have too many obstructions in your mind and everything. So whether some people, you don't know what people are doing when they're prostrating. Some might be thinking of Geshe, some might be thinking of other deities. But most of them talk about Geshe only, really, or they might talk about a particular Buddha that they feel a connection to, like Tara, but mostly it's Kelsang Gyatso.
I mean, it's something that astonishes me within Buddhism. The Tibetan sects have a particularly bad reputation for their abuse of Tantra. Tantra, as you doubtless know, in its origins, is a way of sublimating the sexual drive. But it's become a way of expressing the sexual drive.
Yeah.
So the Naropa University, the Western Buddhist University in Colorado, I know that in the early 1990s they had an internal scandal that they managed to pretty much cover up, that quite a lot of their tutors had AIDS because they believed they couldn't get AIDS.
Right.
And they were having sex with their students, which of course is a criminal offence in the United States of America. Now, Purnam Chodra is out there and very popular in the New Age. And whenever she's asked about Chögyam Trungpa, who was her teacher, and his alcoholism and the sexual abuse of pupils, she puts forward this Buddhist notion, because I didn't see it, I cannot talk about it. And I am horrified by this, that Tibetan Buddhism, for me, seems pretty freaky anyway, and always did.
Yeah.
When I was in the Zen monastery, I said, is there something that's a bit less kind of mystical than Zen? And the abbot laughed at me and he said, well, if you'd said the opposite, I could have sent you to the Tibetans, which is where he went himself, Dajistra, then in the end. But we had to prostrate ourselves 50-something times, calling out the names of bodhisattvas in the Japanese mispronunciation. That Dhyana Buddhism becomes Chan because the Chinese can't say Dhyana. Chan becomes Zen because the Japanese can't say Chan. So it means sitting. That's all it means. Yes. It's a form of Buddhism which is meant to be non-intellectual, where you're only studying a limited, you study the diamond, the heart, the Lotus Sutra, and of course the flower garland. You don't study the Digha Nikaya, you don't study the full sutras, because it's meant to be through practice. But you are going, this thing, you're going down to the ground, touching your forehead on the ground after they've got you up at 6 a.m. to do this thing. And as a night person, that didn't help. And you're calling out, Makakoshio, Dayasho, or some, this. And for me, it was like, what on earth does this have to do with the teachings of Buddhism? Where you've got this guy who comes along and says, don't, it's illusion, don't get caught up in it, meditation is the technique, focus upon compassion, do these things. And it becomes this all-encompassing cult where, you are basically worshipping. You know, I think if I have one problem with religion at all, it's this notion of worship, that if the God who is projected by, within Hinduism and within the Levantine sects, Judaism, Christianity and Islam, and Manichaeism, let's not leave that out, that I wouldn't want to worship anyone that would want to be worshipped.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not clear on what the Buddha actually originally said, if that is even something that happened. So, and it causes problems whenever you try and talk about it. But lots of people have told me, shall we say, that he would have said, don't make statues of me, and don't worship me, and don't take anything that anyone says as the truth, investigate it for yourself.
The Kalama Sutta.
Yeah, so you obviously know more about the sutras than me. But what happened...
That of itself is a curiosity which I find with every Buddhist I talk to, that they haven't read the sutras. And you're going, well, this is what he taught. I mean, it does have some weird things in it, like he had an elephantine penis, apparently. And I'm not sure that I wanted to know that. It's one of the 82 marks of a Buddha, apparently.
Well, in the NKT, there's a...
So a lot of porn stars have the,
Yeah. Well, there's a gold statue that the NKT make of Kelsang Gyatso.
And does it have an elephantine? Sorry.
No appendage.
Oh, probably not a Buddha then.
No, maybe not. I mean, Tara's normally got rather large breasts on display. Lots of male practitioners seem to really like Tara. So you're kind of told that, I mean, I do remember finding it concerning that there was so many pictures of Kelsang Gyatso and statues of him, but you're kind of told that that's not what he wanted, but his followers were so grateful that that's why they made them, and that he represents so much to them, that's what they chose to do, but it can't be because of any narcissism, so but there are other warning signs, like there are signs when you go in the buildings that say it's the only method for achieving happiness, and that NKT centres are the only centres that provide healing of some kind, so there are narcissistic warning signs all over the place, really, but unfortunately people rationalise them and minimise them, and if you haven't read other books, other Buddhist teachings, or been somewhere else, you just don't know. And you're told it's not a good idea to mix traditions because it will be too confusing, and you won't get anywhere.
Yeah.
So people, so people don't mix them.
Yeah, it's astonishing because there are so many people out there who have said tremendously wise and incisive things about belief. One of them was a professor called Angus Graham. And he was his speciality was Taoist belief, which is something that's fascinated me since I was a teenager. And he starts talking about perennialism, and we very much, since that notion came along in the 20s and 30s, then Aldous Huxley wrote the Perennial Philosophy, and it explains in 2 paragraphs why the Buddha really believed in God. It's incredible, such wisdom. But this idea that you'll find this truth that is running through all of the ancient traditions. Yeah. Angus Graham stopped me dead in my tracks by saying, yeah, well, that's so. Now look at all of the disagreements. Now look at all the things that they don't agree on. And this one thing, again, when I first read Julia Kennett's Selling Water by the River, which is a great title for a book, and true, that she said, this Soto Zen that I'm teaching is the only way of doing this. And in the end, I kind of wonder, doing what? This thing off in the future somewhere where I will become enlightened, and I will have this great wisdom and this great serenity. In a lifetime, I've only seen a pretense of this. When I made a YouTube about enlightenment, somebody wrote to me and they said, "Oh, well, you're just a travel agent. You haven't actually been to the place you're talking about." So I said, "Oh, that's fine. I'm happy to talk about it and let's have a conversation." He said, "Watch my guru's video." And I'm sort of, "Oh, so you're a travel agent too? You haven't been there."
Yeah.
If you want to have, and the idea of a conversation is, I have something to say, you have something to say. When you deal with somebody who's involved in an authoritarian group, which people would call a cult, but couldn't care less what we call it, it's an authoritarian group, they will tell you the metaphors and analogies that they've learned. They will parrot these things.
Yeah.
And
they're indoctrinated, if you want to use that word.
And if the idea is that by these practices you will discover your true self, who you really are and what you really are, the reality is that what you'll discover is that the person who's telling you what you'll discover is exactly right, and you'll never discover anything. With Ron Hubbard in Scientology, they sell what they call self-determinism. And to achieve self-determinism, you have to do exactly what you're told. And you will never be able to discover any technology, as they call it. Only Hubbard has that capacity. And of course, ultimately, on final level that wasn't released, so sadly I didn't do it, you find out that he's God. You find out that he's the source of the whole universe. And it goes the same way. Bhagwan, Rajneesh calls himself Supreme God, Bhagwan. Maharishi, I hate it when people call Mahesh Maharishi, great teacher. These Maharaji, these self-appointed narcissists who, when you get into their private lives and you interview or read about, say, Hugh Milne's book about Rajneesh, The God That Failed, you find that these people, in Rajneesh's case, he was taking huge doses of Valium, diazepam, enormous doses. Maranand Sheela, I think, claims he was taking 350 milligrams a day. Now, given that 10 milligrams is the usual top dose, Hugh Milne says it was 50 milligrams, and he probably knew because he was giving it to him. But he'd also have 2 hits on nitrous oxide, and then he'd go out and be the guru. And as with any malignant, vulnerable narcissist, that you've got a leader who basically has learned how to smile in public, but in private their lives are catastrophes.
And it was said in the NKT where I lived, the people who were getting on the throne, I knew about their behaviours, and there was a lot of disturbing stuff going on, and but you were just told, well, people still have delusions, and we're all working towards enlightenment, and if we expected teachers to hold moral discipline all of the time and to not have any issues, we'd have no teachers. So you'd get silence that way. So unfortunately, they just, because they're so hell-bent on expansion and getting people through the door, then they just put people who have criminal backgrounds, who don't have any understanding of mental health, who have no supervision or training, but they can repeat what's written in the books, and they can perhaps lead. It's not difficult to lead one of the contemplation meditations. You just keep reminding the people of the sentence that they're focusing on, and sit there looking zen. So unfortunately, but when you've lived in one of their buildings and you know what's going on in the dark shadows, which are not often talked about, but sometimes people do tell you, what's going on in their lives, or you see something that's disturbing, and then that the whole thing's a joke.
In the Catholic Church, long ago, there was a thing which I think was called the Donatist heresy. And the idea was that a priest who was impure could not bless the sacrament. And the Catholic Church determined that was nonsense, of course. It didn't matter what the priest was doing. The priest had been given the charismatic ability to bless the host so that it would be the body of Christ and the blood of Christ. And one group of heretics who became famous later, the Cathars, the Albigensians, who rose up in the Languedoc, around Toulouse in the south of France, very lovely place. Which was not at that time a province of France, it was an independent country in its own right, an independent state. And this heresy put forward a variety of ideas. Firstly, that women could be priests, and that priests were not priests, they were called parfaits or perfects, and that if their behaviour was in any way imperfect, then they were no longer able to do this. So most traditions pretty quickly accept this donatism, that it doesn't matter what you do. And when we look at the amount of child sexual abuse, child rape, that's happened in the Catholic Church in Australia, the Royal Commission found 8,000 cases committed by 500 priests. The Anglican Church, the Baptist congregation, the Methodists have all had this, the Boy Scout movement, various soccer clubs. That I see the same sort of thing, which is that we will pretend to the outside world while we clean up our stuff because we have something really valuable to give. And my point would be that if you are concealing that, then you have absolutely nothing to give to the world.
No.
If you are immoral and you are covering up the abuse of children, which is the worst thing that human beings can do from my perception, then you really are bankrupt. And it's time to basically sell off or give. Well, Jesus put it nicely when he said, give all that you own to the poor. I think that would be a good start for the various churches to give all the stuff away, to feed, the many starving people in the world and to make institutions that care. Of course, within that, you also have things like in the Catholic Church liberation theology, where in Latin America, many priests said we have to be active in the community because we're living under these terrible dictatorships, most of them unfortunately sponsored by the United States, to stop communism and bad people taking over. So they were excommunicated, basically, because they said, well, we've got to help the community. And when we started talking, before we switched the lights on, I put forward the idea that from the reality of my life is that by becoming involved in organisations, you to some extent become involved in cults. And so I believe in the scale-free network. This, the internet is a demonstration of it, the World Wide Web, that it doesn't matter if you take nodes out, it will continue to function. And I do believe in an equality and a parity between people, that we're a community of learning. There are things that I know a fair amount about, and there are things I know nothing about. I've yet to meet another human being who couldn't teach me something. And that absolutely includes autistic people, Down syndrome people. Everybody has something that I don't know. And I think that cults rise because authoritarianism is written into our society. Our whole history as a species is a history of tyranny.
It is, yeah.
But it doesn't have to be. There are only two societies I know of that are called band societies, B-A-N-D, not double-N-E-D. One is the Baka pygmy, and the other are the San, the so-called Bushmen of the Kalahari. They don't have a tribal chieftain, and they haven't for centuries. Whoever's really good at something, like with the Baka, it's they really like honey, and the bees that they get it from live at the top of trees. So they might be 80 feet up. And so the guy who's best at, or the woman who's best at climbing trees gets to be in charge of going and getting the honey. It's a major cause of death, apparently, among Baka falling out of a tree for young ones. When you look at those documentaries about those people, the Baka and the San, the thing that really strikes me is they're incredibly happy. Their relationships are remarkably good, not having a boss bully psychopath telling them what to do. And then you look at what we have, and I keep saying this on YouTube, and I'm going to keep saying it. We have Donald Trump, Boris Johnson, Duterte, Bolsonaro, Abe, Modi, Putin, President Xi. We continue to put people who are quite evidently narcissistic into these positions because, just like Hitler, they say, no, I know how to solve it. So really intelligent people go, well, I'm so uncertain about the world and what to do. And somebody comes along who has this brash confidence, and the cult of personality comes along. Or should we call that the new religious movement of personality?
Yes.
I think another aspect of NKT that really worries me, I was involved with Scientology, and they are notorious. They're the most litigious organisation in the history of the world. In a single day, they dropped 3,000 cases against the Internal Revenue Service.
Wow.
I became...
In a single day, that's insane,
Yeah, and there are many other times where, when an enemy caves in, they drop the hundreds of cases they've got going. I don't remember how many cases I was involved in. I brought 2 against them, they brought 8 or something against me. But you get to the point where that's all you're doing. But that's just one little aspect of the harassment. I heard this thing that in NKT, a stranger can walk up to you on the street and say something horrible to you. Somebody, has that happened to you? Or?
Well, it hasn't, but I don't live in a place where I've bumped into anyone. I get lots of trolling on YouTube suggesting that I'm all sorts of things, that I'm just a narcissist, and all of the narcissist I'm perceiving in other people, it only exists in my own mind.
Mirroring.
Yeah. That I'm just angry, which is obviously not allowed. The emotion of anger is not allowed even when you're recovering from abuse. So therefore, I'm not taking responsibility for my own stuff, and I'm just projecting my angry mind onto the NKT. It's all sorts, but for me it's been mostly online. I do get some people tell me that most of the perpetrators, like who set up the website against me, for example, actually couldn't fight their own way out of a paper bag in real life. And they get called keyboard warriors, shall we say. But how I'd get treated in person, I don't know. I mean, I certainly wouldn't be hanging around outside NKT centres.
No, I mean, I foolishly for 11 years continued to live in East Grinstead, which is, there are about 1,000 Scientologists living there.
Wow.
And so people come and knock on my door, and, had people march you up and down outside my house with placards. And as the pavement was only that wide, that was a bit difficult. The police kept moving them off. And my house was broken into a couple of times. Wow. Kids would shun my children at school. I was followed by private detectives. Every house in East Grinstead, I'd put out a little red book about them called the Total Freedom Trap. So they will mirror, they'll mimic what you do. And they'll accuse you of, Hubbard was deeply involved in sex magic. There is no doubt about it. The documents exist. It's been talked about in court. There's absolutely no doubt about it. So his claim was that he was sent in by US intelligence to break up black magic in America. He obviously didn't do a very good job. But so they will then accuse me of being involved in magical practices, or say, I've got lots of books on magic, which is true. I have. They're the ones Hubbard read. I must say I find Aleister Crowley, his hero, utterly odious, and I've thankfully he highlights what he thinks are important thoughts in bold, so I don't have to read the rest. But that this notion of harassment, that it seems to me that you can't be a Buddhist and have complete compassion for the world and harass people.
Well, you can't be involved in a cultic group where you adore the leader without defending the leader and attacking those who think that the leader is less than perfect. So you can't be involved in a group and have compassion for people who speak out against the group. I agree with you there. Whether or not you could be a Buddhist of some kind who's practicing at home in their own way and remain a little bit more impartial, perhaps. But most Buddhists practice guru yoga of some kind, and they don't like it if you don't agree with that practice or with the teachings of their particular guru. In the same way, as we know with like Yuval Laor's work, if someone criticises your parent or your child, you can't help but get defensive. I think it's ridiculous to think that we're practicing non-attachment when we're in a Buddhist group, but we don't necessarily spot that when we're in the group. It's only when you leave and you see how people speak to each other that it becomes obvious. But if you're in the group, you're given a special narrative about ex-members, of course, so you're maybe believing that their karma was unfortunate, and that the guru remains perfect. So and anything that challenges that is very painful for you. It causes you so much cognitive dissonance that it's much safer and much less distressing to just really, I would say that the NKT do practice fair game. And unfortunately I didn't know much about fair game until it started happening to me. So of course they don't have a policy about it, but it's seen as perfectly acceptable to attack the character of ex-members. And people don't seem to see that there's a contradiction there with any of the teachings. So,
and I mean, there are various things which for me are significant in what might be called a spiritual practice. Spiritual isn't a word I use very much these last 36 years. One of them is it won't cost you any money. Because, and that's something the Shankaracharya of the North, who is like the Pope of Hinduism in that part of the world, when he was asked questions about Maharishi Mahesh yoga, that he said, but he charges money.
Yeah.
So it's counterfeit. Another thing is this devotion to a personality, to a leader that as Yuval Laor says, and I think we're all pretty aware that you kind of, it's part of yourself really, that you can't say that about my mum, and there's that dimension of it, and I do feel that way if you say anything nasty about my mum.
Yeah.
But there's the other dimension which Yuval was the first person to point out to me, that the teaching of the group becomes the child, the baby. So, you were saying my baby's ugly. And I'm afraid your baby is ugly, actually. It looks like Winston Churchill. But that, your kind of oxytocin response almost, your dopamine, your endorphins, your whole brain response is caught up in this thing. Now, one of the things that really worries me about human society is that perpetual adolescence is the goal. That in a consumer society, you don't want people to think too much, and you do want them to buy too much, and I long averred that when you leave a group, an authoritarian group or an authoritarian relationship, you're about 12 years old.
I felt very stunted, I will admit to that, yeah.
And you can have joined it when you were 60, and it will take you back to this dependency, which is the point before teenage rebellion happens. That where you still hero worship a parent, and so the leader is seen in these terms, and there's a wonderful therapist called Patricia Crittenden, and Nick Child, lovely guy Nick, introduced a book called Raising Parents to me.
Wow.
And she puts forward this idea which she calls the dynamic maturational model. I don't know if it's original to her, but she says rather than classifying people as, you're there on this spectrum and there on that spectrum and you've got this and that going on, and, the 1800 classifications of DSM-5 or however many there are now. I think it was DSM-3 that had 1800. There may be more now.
Yeah.
Rather than starting there, let's talk about maturity. Let's talk about growing up. Rather than talking about enlightenment, let's talk about growing up.
We have a lot of that to do. Yeah.
And I would, again, my friend Jessica put forward, who's a therapist, put forward the concept of, quite simply, emotional autonomy. Now, that can be mistaken if you start talking about personal autonomy, then that's probably something that only psychopaths have. We are interdependent, and that's really good.
Yeah, definitely.
That's the best thing about us, I think.
Yeah.
But emotional autonomy, coming to a point where you don't feel that you have to defend an idea. You are open-minded and can listen to opinions about something without having an aversion response. In the counter-cult world, it's off guilt induction, or Steve Haslam calls it indoctrination. I'm not totally sure why, because I think it is an induction of a feeling. And I would say it's actually shame induction, if we're going to get really technical about it, because guilt's a very good thing, shame's a very toxic thing. And phobia, if you leave the group, then you'll be run over, or, the Buddha will shit on you, or something terrible will happen to you. That there's a third factor, which is aversion. And in looking at a group like the Bolsheviki or the Nazis, who will always come into YouTube within a certain, always be Hitler will be there somewhere within 15 minutes. I think we lasted a bit longer this time. Bringing up an aversion where you have an enemy. Hitler, in fact, said that if you want to bind a group, create an enemy. And he was very good at doing it. I think that is so much a part of authoritarian behaviour. I was challenged, I gave a seminar, and I said, I don't consider anyone in Scientology my enemy. They're not my enemies. And my very good friend, Jerry Armstrong, was in the audience, said, you're wrong. And he went up on stage afterwards to tell everybody how wrong I was, that they're at war with you, so they are your enemies. And it's getting this conception to say, well, yeah, they are my enemies. I don't regard them as my enemies. I regard them as people who have been disinformed and misinformed. Deceived. And their emotions have been harnessed. And for me to grow up, to be mature, and I do hope to grow up one day.
One day.
Is that I won't, my emotions won't be knocked around by other people. If you like, that's what my sense of enlightenment would be, that I'll be able to understand why somebody's hurt and angry. So when Scientologists, I was talking with Sam, who's sitting there looking at us quietly, it's because you should be here, shouldn't you? You're normally here. About a situation where two Scientologists came to my door, and one of them, I let them in. It was like 11 at night or 10:30 at night. And I let them in, and they stood in my hallway glaring at me. And one of them was quite huge, and I was sort of, why have I let this guy in my house? And he was, why do you say nasty things about Scientology's drug rehabilitation program, Narconon? Because it got me off drugs. And I said, oh, that's great. I'm really pleased. What were you taking? And I'm having a different conversation with him to the conversation he's having with me. And I'm saying, well, Scientology does some good. That's great. I'm all for it. But it has to be taken as the whole. What else does it do? And what else has happened? And how much does it cost you? And have you borrowed? Have you borrowed a lot of money?
Yeah. What new addictions do you have now?
Yeah. So exactly that they become junkies for that, and they become as fanatical in getting that as they were. The other guy said to me, "You persuaded my girlfriend to dump me." I said, "Oh, who's she?" And he named this woman. I probably better not name her. It's many years later now, but could still be difficult. And I said, I've never heard of her and I've never met her. And they stood there kind of stumped. And there was almost a conversation. And if you go into the thing, I agree with you that you should feel angry about abuse, indignant, but that doesn't mean being enraged with people. My sense with Scientology is that everybody from the top down, when Hubbard died in 1986, I wept, which is silly because I certainly didn't feel any affection for him. But I believe in redemption. And I saw, I'd wanted to go and visit him in prison and try and help him admit what he'd done, because I think that's good for people. I know a little bit more about narcissism now, and I don't think there'd be much I could do about it. But that sort of tolerance forgiveness, all of the qualities that Buddhism speaks about. Hubbard too spoke about, how you've got to forgive people and, never hate people. But then introduced, as you say, the fair game law, where people can be tricked, lied to, sued, or destroyed. He talked about ruining people utterly, as if this was a natural. Of course, we've got the truth that will make the world a wonderful, loving place where everybody loves each other. But first, you've got to kill half the population.
Yeah, protecting the Dharma is more important than individual people's well-being. And
yet, the Buddha said that there is nothing to fear if the Dharma is lost, because if it is true, it will be rediscovered. It is only false Dharma that needs to be protected.
Yeah.
It shocks and surprises me that people who call themselves Buddhists, they don't know the Eightfold Path, or they just know the Eightfold Path, they on the Four Noble Truths. They haven't actually gone and looked at the astonishing penetrating wisdom of this man, if he actually did exist, because it's only 500 years after he died that anybody wrote anything down. And then they blamed poor Ananda for not asking him to live forever. And he would have done. It's worth saying that despite the vegetarianism of Buddhism, he died from eating meat.
Yeah.
So there are contradictions even in
there are a lot of
teachers.
Contradictions. Yeah.
And the Buddha himself said that he was a human being, that he was not a god. And all of the stories that are plastered on later about the dream his mother had. It's like the hadith among Muslims, that hadith was actually collected over a couple of centuries, these things that Muhammad said. And the authenticity there, you actually pretty quickly get a group of scribes who are going, we can put this together in this way and make this. And then you get to this thing, which I've complained about frequently. I gave a talk in a church years ago, and my assistant, who was a born-again Christian and very wonderful person, Bonnie Woods, she said that she preferred the King James Bible to the vicar. And the vicar was furious. It was like, it's the received word of God. And I'm sort of going, how do you know it's the received word of God? Because it doesn't even claim to be the received word of God. God only speaks about 3 times in the Old Testament. It's a burning bush, and he says, my name is I am that I am. Most of what you're reading is written by people. And now, of course, we have the history because of archaeology. We can go back 1,500 years before the proto-text, which is about 900 BC for Torah, for the Old Testament, and find Babylonian ring seals, which actually tell the Genesis story, where the mother goddess welcomes humanity through her agent, the serpent god, into Eden to eat dates, because of course there weren't any apples in that part of the world till they came from Afghanistan later. And you see how a story is taken, and it's I think an incredible teaching story, Genesis, the idea that by knowing good and evil you learn shame, which makes you cover your naughty bits and separates us out from all of the other species, because we understand, my cat has no shame. So it's an incredible statement, but it's how you decipher it. And when you decipher it as a way of harming other people or of feeling you're superior to other people, which is what it seems to me every religion does, that you occasionally meet people like my friend Christian Shirko or my friend Alexander Dvorkin, who's an astonishing man in Russia. They really are Christians. They wish to help other people, and they live their lives devoted to that. They are humble about themselves, and they're exemplary. Instead of, the first stone Christians who, well, you're not like us. I'm gonna, I can cast the first stone. I can, because you're obviously wrong. So again, I know many militant atheists and people who think we ought to think one way or another. I don't really care what people believe or the metaphors they choose for the universe, because we don't really know what's going on.
No, we don't.
Big Bang. Come on, who had it? When did that happen? And so, returning to the theme that the new Kadampa tradition seems to me to be a perversion. It seems to me that by studying its teachings and living that life, so I'm very grateful that I was involved in Scientology, because I learned a great deal about my own arrogance. And
I learned some about mine too in the NKT.
And the only problem is it took 9 years, and I should have been able to do it in about 3 weeks, because I'm a bit of a slow wit, But so everything we do is useful, but it's only if it eventuates into certain simple things. If you are not practicing compassion, boundless compassion as the Buddha would have it, then you aren't a Buddhist.
No.
You're something else. So
there's a lot of hypocrisy, and I think it's particularly strong in the NKT because so many people live in the centres, and so it's your home and it's your sense of security, and we're territorial tribal animals at the end of the day, and so if someone's threatening your livelihood and your safety by threatening the reputation of the NKT, you will try and destroy them.
It's your family, it's your community.
Yeah.
It's where your sense of belonging is. And again, the sad truth, I imagine, with NKT as with, the Moonies or Scientology or the Krishnas or, the cults of old, we're now seeing the internet cults, we're now seeing a totally new dimension, which we'll talk about elsewhere, because we've been talking for a long time, which is great. But people leaving these groups very frequently suffer from complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Yeah. They suffer from institutionalization, and there is nowhere for them to go.
No.
So you have, in this country, you have Gillie Jenkinson, who can accommodate, about 5 people at a time, despite the European community in 1993 ruling that all countries, the Parliament rather, ruling that all countries must have provision for people who've been subjected to this kind of authoritarian abuse. We don't. The French pay for FECRIS to look over cult groups. Counter cult groups. Although I've spoken there a couple of times, I'm really not sure what they actually do.
Right, yeah, I'm not aware.
So I again, my whole thing is I don't really care whether, what names we use, whether something's called brainwashing or manipulation is my preferred term, because I think we all know that does exist.
Yeah.
Thought reform, thought control, menticide, the killing of the mind, all sorts of exotic terms. The reality is that people can be influenced to do things that are against their best interests. And part of that is normal compliance, but part of it is deliberate. And where a group is evidently antisocial, it attacks people. I was shocked. The other day I was looking for one of your videos, and I couldn't find anything very much, which was very sad. But the first thing that
some
came
of them
up,
are gone, but some of them have come back.
Yeah, well, I'm pleased because I was tremendously impressed by it's just you're there, you're authentic, you're real, you're a person talking about an experience, but a person also with a tremendous understanding of the psychology behind that, and an ease of describing that, which I think's incredibly important, because so few people, it's usually angry ex-members, and then they get off into attacking one another.
I mean, you could say I've got some anger and I'm an ex-member, but
yeah, and that's good, but you've also got some understanding, so that in the ex-Scientology community, when I left work in '96 because I'd been steamrolled and I needed to recover, the former members were pretty, united and friendly. Even, some believed, some didn't believe, but they were friendly. When I came back in 2013, realising that people just don't recover naturally, that you have to give them a little bit of a push, so I started writing again, and talking with some people along the way, that there was so much nastiness out there. That there were, this person does that and this person, and there were people who'd set themselves up as pundits to criticise everyone else, not in Scientology itself, but on the outside.
Were you going to talk about a specific thing that you were looking for on one of my videos?
No, I was going to say that the first thing that came up was this horrific website that attacks you. and it trashes you completely.
Yeah.
I only skimmed it, I must admit, because I know you, so I knew that this was not talking about you. But just from that perspective, if somebody wants to go and look at that site and go, Buddhist compassion, how well have they understood this fundamental? This is the base of Buddhism, the foundation, compassion for all living beings. Now, they can't even get into compassion for human beings.
No, it's not even human beings.
The earwigs have got no looking at all.
No chance, no. Although apparently, the rats get treated quite well in NKT centres, more so than the humans.
I think that probably says something. Yeah. There's a town in India where rats are considered sacred, and so they're allowed to go where they like. And I've seen film of that, and I'm not going to go and live there.
No.
I don't have a particular aversion to rats. I'm compassionate towards them, and they're probably very nice as long as they haven't got the bubonic plague. And you're always within 3 meters of one or something.
Yeah, apparently. Yeah.
I don't know where it is in this room, but so I mean, we must wind up. I could sit here. I could really just sit here for probably the next 10 hours.
We could talk for days, yeah.
and I hope we will. But it's interesting. My understanding is absolutely that there is authoritarianism out there, and it's not good for us.
No.
And the tyrannical way of living. I'm reading Machiavelli's Discourses. People have read The Prince, and it's better to be feared than loved, which was where he's trying to get a job with Cesare Borgia, who was just one of the most evil people ever. And he needed a job, So he wrote that, but he also wrote the Discourses, neither of them published in his lifetime. And he talks about, which is him trying to get a job in a democracy. So you get this same fine mind actually going, oh, this is the nice stuff. And he talks about government. He says there are 3 kinds of government. There's monarchy, which becomes tyranny. There's aristocracy, which becomes oligarchy. And there's democracy, which becomes anarchy. And he then goes on about how you've got to fuse the 3 forms in some way. And I think the great problem of human beings is that we haven't found out how to properly have a democracy politically and socially, to value everybody in the community, and to have compassion. And authoritarianism, which is what forms cult groups.
Yeah.
It's like the disease. It's a congenital disease in humanity, which, if we're going to save the environment from us, we've got to stop fighting wars. It's a point that's not necessarily brought in, but every time you send out a depleted uranium shell, or use all of that fossil fuel to blow things up, or start using white phosphorus on people and things like that, that's not really going to help the human, the sustainable environment. And I believe strongly, almost fervently, that the key to that is getting more people to be able to be emotionally autonomous and to think critically and to collaborate with one another, and if they have competition, that it should be healthy, not selfish competition. So I think I'm going to become a guru now. Actually,
yeah. I mean, I guess, of course, I'm cynical, and at the moment, and I have to sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater for a while, and I think that's okay. But I'm just not sure that we can train people to be more compassionate. And unfortunately, a lot of the organisations that are set up describing themselves as doing that
do the opposite.
They do the opposite, and they're actually quite sadistic and masochistic. So, yeah, you get drawn in thinking that this is somehow a safer place than the rest of the world, and you are influenced to believe that outsiders are more dangerous and that they religiously persecute you, and that keeps you
infested with demons.
Yes, yeah. So, how we were talking about this earlier, weren't we? How do we, because even a lot of the anti-cult groups start to become a little bit culty. So like a lot of them trigger alarm bells for me. And there are even lots of people who get on YouTube and talk about how to recover from narcissistic abuse. By the way, you've got to buy my product. It's the only way to heal from narcissistic abuse.
I don't think you're cynical. I think you're skeptical. Cynical means that you'll negatively colour things. Or maybe you are cynical.
Maybe, for now.
Skeptical is a good place to be, where you go, well, and I think with children, teaching them, as my friend Ara Chelis says, intelligent disobedience, to be skeptical of everything, to say, so, making videos, I say to people, well, now go and check if what I've said is true, see if it adds up. But I think the clue is not in having organisations that train people to do things. I think the key is in having individuals who have discussions and put forward points and encouraging people to say, you are the captain of your own soul. I hate that poem. But that's where you're aiming to, and learn from people who have experience, but don't become devoted to them. The guru pandit relationship is good for children, but once you've reached adulthood, then you need to be taking responsibility. I again and again and again refer to Escape from Freedom by Erich Fromm. This incredible book, this man who first defined malignant narcissism and who talks about the pseudo-self, this idea that people don't have a self. They're just doing what they think the people around them want them to do. And I think our school system, all of our systems are aimed at consumer systems and aimed at making this false, am I doing the right thing now? Am I approved of now? And creating narcissism, rather than saying, what's original to you? What have you got going on that you're good at? And encouraging people rather than discouraging them. But encouraging them to find their own originality, which they're not going to find by being part of any particular group.
No, I mean, all cultic groups destroy your spontaneity, your authenticity, your creativity. Most of the creativity is, if there are creative activities, it's not real creativity, So
it's painting by numbers.
Yeah. Very much so.
The Steiner schools, which come out of Rudolf Steiner's work, Anthroposophy, you can always tell if somebody's trained in a Tobias art school, their art schools, because their paintings all look the same. They use the Goethe colour system, which differs from most others. So there'll be blue, red, yellow doing this. And any system, I suppose with learning to play the piano, that you can learn from the dots or you can learn by ear. I have a friend who trained as a violinist as a child and can't play because he says, I can't play without the dots. And so there's no me in it. So he just bought a piano and put it in his house. His son is one of the, I'm a drummer, I've played music all my life. His son is one of the 3 great musicians I've played with. And he never had a lesson. He just had a piano in the house. And encouraging people to get that balance of their own, understanding of life and saying, actually, nobody's worked it out yet. Starting from that point of view that, we've got to be able to check and test. And I think there are just certain principles rather than a kind of, great big, university course or what have you. I despair of universities, I really do. I've met so many psychologists who knew nothing. It's like, just like everybody else, it's like, advertising affects other people. I am invulnerable. That they've not been put through enough, putting their hands in a bucket of cold water and a bucket of warm water and then putting them into to find out, to actually do the things that teach you. I had my kids do that when they were quite little. It's like, one of my hands is hot, the other's cold. Understanding context, understanding things that directly. But I think it isn't making courses and doing all of this stuff, not anymore. I think it's stimulating people to explore and to be curious, which institutions and schools and Dharma centres don't tend to do. They want to clone you.
Yeah, well, I would say that because I spent so long at uni studying psychology, that was one of the vulnerabilities, because I was used to being told information that I needed to absorb and be a good student, and I was used to the university model where there were, tutors and there was a hierarchy, and it was reasonably patriarchal, and that made me vulnerable to recruitment. And I did a lot of intellectualizing of emotional pain through studying it. And, I've had to say to some of my family and friends that, just because I studied it from an academic perspective, that wasn't a safety. I'm no less vulnerable than anyone else. And actually, I need you to know that I'm not perfect. I feel a lot more these days, and I need that to be okay with you. And just because I went to university to study psychology doesn't mean that I really understand the mind. I don't really like saying the mind as if it's completely separate these days. But even psychologists,
the me.
Yeah. I mean, even psychologists. And other mental health professionals, we don't know, and there are a lot of things coming out now. I don't know if it's because I just follow a lot of it on social media, so I'm seeing it more now, or whether there genuinely is more coming out. But about how experiments that have been reanalyzed, actually, when someone else looks at your data, they don't find what you found. Yeah. And there's a lot of narcissism in universities, in lecturers who want buildings named after them. I wouldn't I don't want to say that I don't think there's anything in all the psychological theory that's been developed over the years, of course, but I think you've still got to be able to hold it lightly. And to be curious, and to never think that because you don't. And ultimately, we're never going to know for sure. And there's not a cure for most things. And like our deeply entrenched habit patterns and our attachment styles, we don't know enough about that still, and we don't have ultimate methods that are guaranteed to heal any of it. And one of the arguments that people sometimes troll me with is, well, you've clearly had mental health problems and you can't solve those, so I wouldn't trust you. But ultimately, I'm going to keep being myself and saying I don't have the answers, and anyone who tries to sell you a cure, says that you're full of problems that need solving and that they have the solution, don't trust them.
No. And I mean, there is tremendous scientific psychology, but the point of science is basically that it keeps moving.
Yeah.
And it means that we can reinterpret something. Raymond Dart, in 1925, you have the Thung baby. He becomes world famous. He's found hominid fossils in the Schwarzkranz cave. He's at Witwatersrand, I love these words, Witwatersrand University, and he finds these tusks that come from something like a saber-toothed tiger, and he finds hominid skulls that have been penetrated, and he goes, oh, these, the tusks are found in burials with hominids, and so he's going, oh, they've been used as weapons. And this actually kick-started Konrad Lorenz and the whole aggression idea that we are really fundamentally violent, psychopathic creatures. That's what humanity is. That fed, of course, into Nazism and all sorts of social Darwinian ideas. Then, in 1977, a guy called Bob Brain, who'd taken over the chair at Witwatersrand University, I love that one, and went to the Schwarzkranz cave, he had these tusks analysed and put them under an electron microscope, and he found that there were these little grooves and patterns on them. So he had his students go out, because he had a hypothesis about this, and he found that what they'd been used for was digging up parsnips. And also that when you looked at the skulls, there were always two tusk marks, indicating that the hominid skulls that had been found had been killed by the animals. Then when the animals had died, somebody went, I could use that as a digging tool. That influenced all of thinking for decades, and it still hasn't gone away. So you can reinterpret existing information. We can know more, we can understand better, but in the end, the individual, it's a journey you have to make for yourself. We can alleviate problems. If somebody is very anxious, there are things you can do. Don't have to give them diazepam. There are ways of helping them. Getting them to meditate isn't necessarily one of them, frankly. If somebody's had a traumatic experience that lingers with them and makes them hypervigilant and reading subtext into everything that's said to them and startled at everything that goes on around, you can help these people to feel better. I heard something really stupid said by somebody who's a leader in the countercult world, so I'm not going to name this person, but it was a man. Let me say that. And he said that somebody who had been in battle and still grieved over lost friends was not healed.
Yeah.
And I'm going, that never happens. When I think about the dreadful things that have happened in the world, I should cry.
Yeah. I mean, I think, and I said to you earlier, that I'm of the quite strong opinion now that there's just so much spiritual bypassing of emotional pain, and that a lot of these spiritual models, and that includes the way that we now use meditation in the West, has been used to suggest that we should be feeling less. And that we are supposed to be happy all the time, which from an evolutionary perspective is not the case.
It's not going to happen.
No. And that if you are, in a state where you don't appear put together, that there's something wrong with you that needs to be fixed, and it solely exists in your mind and strategies and interfering with that. I think it helps to make other people around you comfortable. But there's nothing wrong with feeling. It can be really uncomfortable and difficult. But one thing I've learned from my experience is that social support, like you said earlier about interdependence, unfortunately, a lot of the spiritual ideas have been used to suggest that we shouldn't need each other, and that we should be able to be completely self-sufficient, self-actualized beings. And I think maybe a lot of us struggle to trust people and to be in relationship with people. And so we maybe sometimes get drawn into spirituality when we're trying to avoid intimacy.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's certainly what happened to me, actually. It was after a heartbreak, and lots of people move into...
Me too.
Yeah, that seems to be a really common theme, because we maybe can't... we're vulnerable at a time when we perhaps, we don't want to be emotionally intimate with someone because it's too scary and painful. And that's when we're vulnerable to these ideas that suggest that we actually, we're totally in control with our own mind, and that we don't need to give each other empathy or anything, because actually all of these groups, from what ex-members tell me, there seems to be less empathy and less, everyone's kind of working on it with their mind, but they're not acting in a way to support each other and stand up for each other or point out things that are abusive. So your experiences of abandonment actually because you might be really struggling with something and someone in front of you is working on that with their mind, but you've got no idea. They've just got this glassy look on their face because they're in their own head and they're not actually showing any empathy to you. And when we're not supporting each other emotionally, cortisol, adrenaline and everything, we're not soothing each other. We're in a high state of stress. And yet we still think that we should be able to meditate, which is something which is much harder to do when you're stressed and frustrated and traumatized. So I think in a lot of these spiritual groups, you're also told that it is like your family, which is then very confusing because it's an emotionally invalidating family and emotionally neglectful family. And I think, Miriam Anders' research now is saying that the transgenerational trauma from this in Buddhist groups, we can't possibly know the impact of it yet because the Me Too movement's only just spreading to Buddhism and people are only just recognising that it is abuse because of the crazy wisdom teachings and the idea that abuse is all in your mind. It takes, and the fear that you have about speaking up about the group and the guru, it takes people a really long time to even validate that they are traumatised and that they have experienced abuse. So I think it's going to take us quite a long time to know how we support each other in healing that and how we feel safe in relationship with each other to do that, given we've been basically indoctrinated with all these fears of intimacy.
Yes. And again, I said earlier that for me, after 35 years, I finally gave up on the idea of enlightenment and replaced it with the idea of relationship. That my relationship with my 4 children, with my grandchild, with my brothers, and their wives, with my thankfully many friends, means that I have been through periods in my life where I had no support. When my mother was dying, I looked after her, and it just so happened that all of the 5 closest friends I had were going through dreadful things in their lives, and they were no longer there for me. And so I went through a long period where there was nobody to talk to, and that was, in the long run, I think I'm probably quite resilient. It said that a small amount of people have this resilience. So I think I had it beaten into me. That because I came away from that and said, well, therefore it's about, it's about relationship. It's about, having people who will care for you without exploiting you, without having an agenda, without being paid.
Without you paying them.
And giving that yourself and teaching that, with children. My concern is very much for prevention because recovery takes a long time. I think for somebody who's been through a severe experience, they can anticipate. And again, there's no standard. Some people just shrug it off. They really do. And they walk away. And it's like, well, I'm doing something else now. But most people will spend years recovering. Whereas, in fact, if you teach kids certain simple things about how to recognise abusive people and abusive practices, probably in a few hours. But there's nothing in our educational system doing that.
No.
And certain simple ideas, that, the things that Stanley Milgram and Phil Zimbardo found out, the things that Bob Cialdini and Anthony Braccanis teach, understanding what propaganda and PR is trying to do to you, I actually feel tremendously optimistic because I think this is the first time in human history where these tools have become available, and we can possibly have a non-traumatized generation. I did a study of the hippies, just to write a novel. So not a scientific study, but looking at American and British hippies, and I grew up on the tail end of the British hippie movement. I wanted to know why these groups were so different, knowing so many people went through it, and it's called Vietnam. And it's not that Britain wasn't fighting a war, Malaysia and Borneo at the same time. It's just we didn't have conscription. So you weren't being threatened, and there weren't all of these casualties coming back. 58,000 killed Americans, 2 million Vietnamese maybe. All of the families are being traumatised. All of the soldiers coming back are traumatised. And you've got PTSD throughout the society. Yeah. So if it's possible to have a generation where children are not beaten at school, which we don't do anymore, thankfully, they're not yelled at school, I'm afraid that still happens, they're not discouraged at school, they're encouraged to learn. Things that Ken Robinson talks about, where where kids actually get in early and stay late and go through the weekends. What? Yes, there are such schools, and they get great academic performance because they're doing stuff they want to do. And this idea that school should be a devastatingly boring environment, So I think the tools are all there. It's just putting the toolkit together and saying, yeah, this isn't about this organisation is now going to condition you to behave in this way, but here are the tools. Yeah. And kids will pick them up and they'll share them. This process called flipping, where kids watch a video and then they explain it to the kids that didn't understand it. And the teacher's role is now to make sure that they're pairing up the right kids to teach each other. Because, the older you get and the more you understand a subject, the less you become able to explain it to others, I fear. When it's new to you and you've just got it, it's very easy to explain it. So I think there are many ideas abroad that can change the society. And, I didn't for a long time. Yeah. For a very long time, I did not feel very hopeful. But I do, I very much so now. But it is things like this. It's things like people sitting down and talking, and then somebody else goes off and they hear what we're saying. They go, I'd like that bit. They comment on it. They talk about it. They discuss. And they realise that their opinion, I'm not for postmodernism as a general theory. I think it's absolutely stupid that my ideas on gravity should have equal weight to Einstein's. They don't. His were much heavier. But I do feel that we all have a right to an opinion, and that developing a personal opinion and being able to say, I disagree with that, I agree with that, I can take that further. Yeah. Enabling children, enabling young people to do that is going to be vitally important and can make a change. And we probably better finish up, because I don't think there can be any battery left in anything anymore. And this has been fantastic. It's been such a pleasure. Great. Yeah, so thank you. I'm still John Atack.
And I'm still Michelle Haslam.
Thanks a lot.